Welcome, Chris, to the show. I'm really glad to have you here. It sounds like we're going to talk about some passionate things for you. And if you can let the audience know, what your background is, what you're doing today, how you're making a difference, let's dive in.
Sure. So my name is Chris Yoko. I run a firm called Yoko CO, or some people call it Yoko Co. We have no preference what you want to call it by. And we help organizations that have a passion or purpose beyond just profit make a bigger impact in the world. The way we say it, if you're able to see our video, we've got our slogan over my shoulder, which is to do good better. So we help organizations that are doing good do that good better. And we believe the greatest lever any organization has in making that impact is their web presence. And so that tends to be the area that we work in. So web design, development, search engine optimization, and content production to create a positive impact in the world.
Hey, well, that's awesome. It always amazes me how someone like yourself can come up with such a simple yet powerful mission statement, to do good better. And so many of the rest of us struggle with, way too many words, and we just can't seem to put it through the funnel and get it down to something simple. So I noticed in your stuff that you and your team, how did you say you positively impacted or influenced 100 million people last year through your clients' websites?
Yeah. So our goal, we made this pivot in 2014 to work exclusively with those like-minded organizations that we feel really well aligned with. And it was kind of that time, I don't know if you remember it, but everyone was talking about their BHAG. I don't remember what it stood for. It's like big, hairy, aggressive goal, something.
Audacious
goal.
Yeah,
and
Jim Collins.
Yes, absolutely. And so ours was, we said, if we could positively impact the lives of 100 million people, that would be incredible. And my parents kind of raised me, and I think a lot of people would be able to relate, where it's like, hey, it's your responsibility to leave the world a better place than you found it. And I was like, oh, this would be a great way to just kind of quantify that. And if you could make the world even a little bit better for that many people, like, you've done some good. And so ultimately in 2014, we decided that was going to be our metric. And then the way that we measure it is exactly like you said. We take a look at a client's data and analytics before we started working with them and afterwards. And that delta is what we attributed to our major impact. And our goal was to impact 100 million people by the end of 2020. And we ended up doing a little over 127 million was the final number.
Awesome. Well, I would like to challenge you on one piece that you said there, is that your parents raised you to leave the world better than how you found it, or however you worded it. And I think one of the challenges we have in America and globally in many spots right now is that's not being taught anymore. And
right.
the world's in trouble. And I'm not negative, I'm a positive guy, but I also try to be a realist. And so
you can be positive, but also note, like, we're driving towards a cliff and we should stop.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. So I'm really interested in diving into your passions today, because what I saw on your website is you have a manifesto. And there's not a lot of leaders who have a manifesto and can kind of walk through that and why you got that and what you're trying to do, because we do need to do good and we need to do it better. And so many people today, I say, live by 3 common values. It's all about me. It's not my fault. And it's not my problem. So I don't have to do anything, baby. I'm just focused on me and what feels good. And to me, even if it hurts you. So I don't want to go down that route in this podcast, but let's talk about where your manifesto. Why did you come up with that? And how does that drive you?
So it's been an interesting journey. It does dovetail with kind of our BHAG and the genesis of that, which was, I think all of us, aim to have some, like, what's the purpose of life? And we all kind of explore those existential questions. And I'd always been dealing with them. And the way I grew up, like, a lot of the models were like, oh, you have like your personal life and you have your professional life, and there the two shall meet. And I was kind of running my life that way. And whenever we got to a place, we were working with some organizations. We had a team of 4 at this time, and it was early 2014. We were working with some organizations that we were super excited to work with. And then there were some where we were like, maybe we stop answering all of our emails and phones and they'll just go away. Like, how do we get away from this? And it got so bad that it got to the point where we basically said, like, maybe we all just go back to freelancing so we don't have to work with some of these people anymore. And at that time, a friend of mine had just come out with a book, a woman named Marissa Levin. She wrote a book called Built to Scale, and SCALE was an acronym about using advisory boards. And I had been proofing it as she had either just released it or was about to release it. And I was like, oh, like she got a lot of direction from our advisory board. That could be a cool idea. We put together an advisory board, and a big part of what they challenged me on is that whole personal and professional divide. And they said, if you're going to be leading a team, like, why are you doing the things you're doing? What's the intent? What's the purpose? And really pulled a lot of my individual purpose into the organization and made me review it and start to really think about it intentionally. And it was a lot of stuff I wasn't able to articulate, and I'm still not great at articulating it. I think it's just something you continue to refine. But a quote that always landed really heavily for me was Carl Sagan's quote, "Life is a way for the universe to know itself." And as somebody who was raised very religiously and didn't get a lot of the answers that I wanted from there, I knew that there was a lot more than just us, and I wanted to help be a part of whatever it is that helps advance that. And that seemed to be a way that really resonated. And then I just kind of started to work backwards from there. I mean, that's how we do most of our problem solving, is like, all right, if that's the end goal we're trying to get to, where are we now? And how do we connect the 2 points?
So can you walk us through the manifesto?
Sure.
If we start, it's at number one, kind of talk about it, and maybe there's a story behind it that brought it about, and a story of when you've implemented it, how it radically transformed something. Because I'd like to have our audience consider how going through this type of life exercise can really change what they're doing and the meaning they're finding in their work. Because you mentioned I had my work life and then I had my personal life, and never shall the two meet, type of thing. And then you realize actually that doesn't always work. It can be much stronger, that who I am personally is also who I am at work. I don't have to put on the mask or cut out that, block out that part.
Absolutely.
We spend too much time at work. It needs to be meaningful. So how did you get there?
So yeah, it's interesting because you talk about like kind of the mask. I think that's a metaphor we use a lot of times. And I had been at a retreat at one point, and we did this exercise where it's like, all right, you take off all the masks. I'm like, what's behind it? And then you're like, oh, I'm just a bunch of like these different masks, and these different facets of me are me. It's just different facets. And so bringing all of those to bear, I think, is a really empowering thing. So for me, it was a really instrumental thing in feeling really well aligned with the work that we do and being able to be really excited about getting up and doing the work. So I'm happy to kind of walk you through kind of the key tenets I have outlined, and then I can talk a little bit about how I think that applied not only to myself, but like our whole team. And I think there's a lot of lessons there that others could potentially learn from if they want to lean into it. Cool.
Go for it.
So again, like my way of problem solving tends to be like, all right, why are we doing anything? And okay, if that's the objective, let's work backwards and think about how we solve those problems. And so the kind of core thing I was thinking about is like, if life is a way for the universe to know itself, and let's say on a scale of 1 to 100, 100 is like a consciousness that understands like the way every single atom interacts with every single atom throughout the eternity of time. Then we're at like maybe a 3, a 2. We're not super far along that spectrum. And I was like, what kind of things could we do to help advance that? And kind of the first thing that I looked at was the first kind of tenet I have outlined is that we have to embrace organizations or companies that play the role of, I call it a custodian, anyone who's kind of a caretaker. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. But one of the key ones is I'm in the world of technology, and technology, like the pace of change is only accelerating, and governments are having trouble keeping up with it. People are having trouble keeping up with it. Like our evolutionary biology is having trouble keeping up with it. So the only things that I think you can really look to lean into and support are the companies that are at least doing this mindfully and in a way that looks out for more than just a bottom line. Because they're going to be the ones that, if they end up having more and more power and more dollars to influence the direction of the world, are hopefully the ones that are going to drive it in a direction that's better for all of humanity as opposed to just worse. And there's a really interesting short story called Manna, M-A-N-N-A. It's like 18 pages or something, but it's just fascinating, like dystopia, utopia that the guy gets into super quickly. It's a fascinating read.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. One version is like, okay, here's the companies that just pursue a bottom line and they use automation and AI and blah, 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 until basically people just are born and die in camps almost. And then here's an organization that harnessed all the same technology, but in a way that was meant to give people more options and freedom and flexibility. And it's like, here's this duality of like a dystopia and a utopia that all exist in the same world. And we're all brought about using the same technology, just applied differently. And
I think it's really interesting because today people don't think of being a custodian or a steward. They don't think of taking care of stuff. You just throw it out. And also you think about, I was speaking with my wife just last night. I was saying, because we've talked about this a little bit. I've said, what if we went on a 90-day Amazon fast? I mean, I'm a Prime member, so we don't do the videos. We don't buy anything on Amazon. We only go to local stores that we want to support, lowers the carbon footprint, maybe, does whatever. But it's, and kind of what you're saying is that we make a decision that we want to support organizations and people ultimately that we feel are being, good custodians, to use your term.
Yeah.
Because if we make that stronger, that's ultimately good for all of us. It's kind of like working for the common good in some ways.
Absolutely. It's just driving in that direction. It's interesting because you alluded to this earlier. A prior client of ours, a woman named Esther Perel, she had been a part of this. I think she'd either quoted it or been a part of the survey and had shared that previous generations, when interviewed about what was the greatest thing, that they could have for their child or the greatest ideal to raise them under, was to be able to contribute to society, to have a meaningful impact on the world. And the more recent generations, it's just to be happy. And you start to think about that and you're like, oh, I know a lot of really unpleasant people who I think are very happy themselves, but are not creating a better world for anybody around them. And I think a lot of the technology that's around right now, and I kind of get into this in the manifesto as well, is we're not super great at dealing with super stimulus. So like all of our natural things that evolve to help us survive, if I'm afraid more information helps me survive. So I'm going to naturally pay attention to the things that invoke, fear or anger. And so social media, being ad driven, hey, these are the things people pay attention to. So it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And I think ultimately, unless we do some really intentional things, and again, it's the companies that are behind it. They're the ones who could choose, hey, you know what? We're going to optimize our algorithm not to just be based on maximizing advertiser revenue. We're going to optimize it to be a better fit for society. And yes, revenue and profit need to be a part of that, but does it need to be the holy grail? I don't think so.
Yeah, or they're going to shut some people off their platform because they don't agree with their views, which we may like today, but tomorrow they may shut down somebody that we actually like and we want them to stay on. But we don't think about that because we like their decision. So anyway, so we better not go there. So, okay, so that sounds great. So what's the second part of your manifesto?
So I think a big part of that first part is, having companies that are willing to play that role of custodian. And then two is, and they're obviously all related, is adopting, the way that I'd phrase it whenever I wrote the manifesto was adopting a currency that better aligns with our environment. I don't necessarily know if it needs to be an absolute currency, but it needs to be a monetary policy that I think takes into consideration the fact that we've been making huge withdrawals from a giant piggy bank that we inherited in terms of fossil fuels and all of the things that we've been burning up. Like, thankfully, we seem to be at a point where renewables just over the last 12 months have become cheaper in a lot of cases than their fossil fuel counterparts. But we need to be incredibly mindful of the full cost of impact of any transaction. And so not only on the energy side, but on the pollution side, is everything has kind of a natural cycle. And for some reason, when it comes to productization, we're just like, no, the end of the cycle is we dump it in a hole in the ground and we pretend it doesn't exist.
Oh yeah.
And I think if we combine that with the fact that companies can move money more quickly than governments can. I mean, we see Apple play this shell game. I'm just using them as an example. Tons of companies do it, but they play that shell game where they're like, oh, we've got a company in Ireland that licensed us technology and the license happens to be this much. And now that, money goes into an account in a business in the Cayman Islands and blah, blah, blah. The money just moves around. Companies can do that much more quickly than governments can. And I think governments are going to struggle to adapt, especially as we get into, the more decentralized currencies, your blockchain-based things like Bitcoin or Chia is a newer one that is, I think, much more aligned and adopted with, the greener side of technology. And that was the whole genesis of it. And so being able to adopt a structure for currency that is really mindful of the full impact we make in the world and calculates that as a part of cost, I think is going to be really critical, just because we can't optimize for things that are just intended. We have to optimize for the things that are actually going to be measured and that make an impact.
Yeah, I think there was something in the news I read just this morning that Walmart's going to put 350 million. Doesn't sound like enough. It might have been, but billion sounds like too much. So it must be million, 350 million into helping some of their suppliers manufacture domestically instead of overseas.
Oh, good deal.
Yeah, and this was this builds on some money that the federal government has allocated to do the same thing. But Walmart and just like you remember McDonald's, they came out with better fries, if you like fries, because they took control of how the potatoes were being produced.
Yep.
So they would be those better fries, and Walmart can have a positive impact also. And I think once again it goes back to what you're saying, that the whole stewardship issue or custodian issue, if we can support those people that are doing good, they're working for the common good, and they have some integrity, that's going to work out much better for us in the long run than the company that's given us a dopamine rush because we get some dings on our phone or whatever it is.
No, you're absolutely right. It's just being able to think long term. And unfortunately, it's again, like we all have that reptile brain that's just how we react. And you've got to be really, really intentional to counteract that. And especially whenever you have diffusion of responsibility through like the market and everything, it's well intended, but I got to do what my manager tells me. Well, the manager's got to do what the VP tells them. VP has to do what the executive board does. Then the executive board has to listen to the board. Board's protecting shareholders. Shareholders, the employee. And now the cycle continues. It's like, the buck doesn't stop with anyone. It's really easy just to continue to pass it.
Well, and I think it's particularly important to notice that each one of those statements is a partial truth that leads you to believe a lie when you become like a lemming that's just going to go off the cliff, using your cliff metaphor again, where you're like, oh yeah, I just got to do this. Well, when you take it to that extreme, it's actually a lie.
Yep.
Whereas the partial truth is, you do have a responsibility to your boss or to shareholders or whatever, but it doesn't mean you do the wrong thing. You still have to think. Anyway, exactly. Sorry, I don't want to slow down your manifesto here. So
no, not at all. I think, that point is very well received. And it's also, how many terrible things have happened because people are just following orders? Like that's not just the person who might be a quote unquote like superior to you in terms of like your work environment is just another person. It's a peer, and they're all equally weighted as far as, our votes count the same, our ultimate contribution to society as people and the ripple effect we all have nets out to be equivalently the same. Like you have to do those things that are in the best interest of the world and population as a whole, not just, the direct order from whoever's handing it down to you.
And then we could do a whole nother episode on how that's especially challenging today when you have bullies who are trying to force you to believe what they believe. And they're on the right and the left. They're all across the spectrum.
Oh, they're absolutely.
And the funny and not funny, the sad thing is that, one person on one side will say, well, the other side's a bully this way, but they're doing the same thing. It's like, it's crazy.
It's just like the antithesis of like yin and yang. It's just two bullies pushing each other around endlessly. And it's like, you're both guilty of the things you're accusing the other of.
Yeah.
Somehow. Yeah.
And somehow you're blind to it. It's a bizarre evil or misunderstanding or something in the world, but it's kind of scary. So I like this manifesto. So this can help, can be a piece of the puzzle to help us have the courage to face it. So where are we going next?
So after the currency side, we start to get to a place where with technology and automation, the value of human labor is net decreasing in terms of, having during the Industrial Revolution, working a 50-hour week to put food on the table. And now for some reason, feeling like you have to do the same just to have a bunch of like extra things. I think that's going to start to give way. It'll probably take maybe a couple of generations for some of those old habits to die hard. But as we get there, I think we're going to have a realization that we have a lot of these resources and the means to distribute them in a way that we could provide them to our population in a way that would enable people to better pursue their purpose and like greatest level of impact. And I think about, I don't remember who the quote was by, but it was essentially, I'm not so much interested in like the size and weight of Einstein's brain, but of how many Einsteins have perished in fields and, warehouses and stuff that we never knew about. And there's like these odd stories you run into around like a Philo Farnsworth who basically invents television out of a farm in Iowa. And if you were able to bring all of the disparate perspectives and heuristics that we have as a population to bear on these problems, even if it's a 1 in a million, it's almost like investing in your citizenry as the way like a venture fund would invest in startup companies, is like just invest in believing that we can all contribute. And obviously you have to have a culture that also believes in building a better world, and that being a component of why we all exist. But with that there, the amount of breakthrough I think we could have as a society and the advancement of knowledge would be unparalleled.
But doesn't this also allude to possibly the change where today public education focuses so much on teaching a very rigid curriculum that many kids will never use, and also teach kids what to think when it comes to certain social beliefs or whatever you want to call them? I'm not using the proper term, versus how to think. Okay. So how to think, first of all, to discern truth. What are actually the facts? When we have all the fake news and all the fake facts online and these very convincing conspiracy videos, whatever. I have an adopted son who for a year or two believed 9/11 was all a hoax. The planes never crashed and whatever, because it was a very convincing video that was put out. And I watched it with him, and then we found where it was false. But so discerning truth, and then also teaching the creativity side, like you talk about, because I believe Americans in particular, but many other nations, we have incredible power as citizens. But if we lose the ability to think for ourselves and have the courage to make good decisions, then we're going to lose it, because we're going to be manipulated out of it. But anyway, I'm going down a rabbit trail. But
no, I think you're absolutely right. Like, I mean, if we don't have a level of, I think it starts culturally, but I think it's built through the education system, where the prior education system is still based on a model that was, I can't remember what country it originated in. I read this whole breakdown of it, but basically, it was still in use for the Industrial Revolution, where it's like, all right, great, we need people to do certain jobs. And so we need them to have a certain amount of knowledge to be able to do these certain jobs and plug in. And that was that. And it's like, that world doesn't exist anymore. And we're doing all of this training to prepare people for a world that existed 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or a world that existed at the time of them being that age, as opposed to, like you said, just being able to think critically. And I especially think in the future, more important than ever, is just going to be in the habit of never stop learning. Like, it's not going to be a place where you get a degree, you're an expert in this thing. It's like, all right, like now you know what you're talking about, and you're going to have to just continue to go along with the changes and be best of breed, as they say, as time goes on. But I think that's absolutely a cultural change and shift that needs to happen.
Yeah. And of course, consistent with what you're talking about, we have to teach soft skills, teamwork, leadership, critical thinking, how to avoid conflict, how to manage conflict, time management, et cetera. Because those are going to be the things that free people to then go have meaningful lives.
Well, especially there's a book called Dream Teams. I think it's Shane Snow, and great breakdown. But he talks a lot about different perspectives and different heuristics brought to bear on a problem ultimately yield more optimal solutions. And he gives some great stories. Like the first year the FBI had hired a female agent was the year they caught Capone, because she thought of like a different way to approach it than just a bunch of guys had. And the interesting part of the research was the more different the perspectives and backgrounds tend to be, yes, you get very different solutions, but you also get more conflict in the organization. And the thing that tends to allow that conflict to take place productively is to be aligned around a mission or an impact, and to then be able to kind of set the ground rules for how to have meaningful conflict, as opposed to like attacking each other individually. And I think there are so many of those things that are just missing in school now, where it's like, let's just try to avoid all conflict altogether. It's like people from different backgrounds and different viewpoints and a strong belief in a thing. Like, conflict's not inherently bad. It can be a really good and powerful tool. It's just, you need to learn how to harness it and not to confuse it with bullying or just arguing for the sake of arguing. And unfortunately, there's such a conflation of all of those things now that I think people have been like, all of it is bad and it shouldn't happen, and put it away.
or rally them around a manifesto. Okay, what's the next one?
So stepping in from there, I think we start to get into like the world of, I know they're more divisive terms, but like a UBI, UBE, UBH, so universal basic income, universal basic education, universal healthcare, like those things that if we as an organization, or we as a global organization or culture, if we have the ability to protect everyone in the same way you think about a small tribe, if we were 20 people, you, me, our families, a thing that makes any one of us better makes all of us better. If you're a better hunter, my family's going to eat better. If I'm a better farmer, your family's going to eat better. Those things hold true even at a larger scale. It's just we lose the ability to kind of keep it all in perspective. And I think if we were able to think about our world and our global population as more of a tribe, it would be easier for us all to go like, oh, that's right. Like if they become really good at that, like for as much vitriol as he might get, like if Jeff Bezos doesn't do a lot of the groundbreaking things he does to create Amazon, like a lot of the people that copied him and a lot of the things that were good about his model, like don't happen. Like there's ultimately net improvements. And then of course you can take that too far to where it's only in pursuit of a dollar, and that's an issue. But I think being able to get to a place where we are really mindful of the potential impact of all citizens and have that kind of care and kind of almost a step stool up to Maslow's hierarchy is one of those instrumental things that's going to help usher in, a next era of greatness for humanity. And then, ultimately what comes next.
Well, I think that's true. And I think one of the challenges is getting people to work together, because I think really the core of America is giving everyone equal opportunity. And what we're seeing in history is that's not true. Mm-hmm. From the beginning of the nation, as good as the intentions were, there was slavery in place. Women were not given the right to vote. There were classes already set up, although it was much better and things were better. We have not been effective at really trying to level the playing field. And now it gets more complicated because now we have kids that are growing up in poverty and they have an abusive parent, two abusive parents. They have somebody on drugs. They live in a violent neighborhood. I mean, there's a lot of complications to it. So how do we give people a hand up and give them that equal opportunity when we not only have to reach the child, whatever age they are, that we want to engage at, but we also have a home environment that's very unhealthy, if not dangerous, that we have to overcome so they can have that equal opportunity. And I think this is really cool stuff to work on. I think they're big problems. I think you and I are on the same page. Yeah, we can do this, but we got to do it together.
Exactly. It's like they're huge problems, but as we've seen, like they're not insurmountable. Like even whenever you mentioned the country being founded, it was like, is it perfect? No. And they know that in order to create a more perfect, like we're constantly trying to create something that's better. And as long as we're moving forward, we're going in the right direction. My wife, Bridget, she is a educator in a Title I school. And so she's, very familiar with the families that, have this background. And what's really interesting, a juxtaposition she had kind of enlightened me to was, well, yes, they're super busy and sometimes the parents aren't always around. A little bit of that has also created a really tight-knit community where like some of the kids will go over to this parent's house because that parent's there and like they'll all kind of combine together to create like meals. And so, I mean, I think that there are lessons to be learned from like all the different facets of where these problems originate to be able to, like you said, create that equality.
But also what you're bringing up is that even in the midst of some challenging circumstances, there are some families that have some values and they're bonding together and they're working together. So they're making certain their kids are going over to somebody else's house where somebody's there, where they'll be safe and they can maybe get some guidance. And so we may have to dig a little bit. We may have to work a little bit. We may have to provide some training and limited support for these things to happen, but we don't have to give up and walk away.
Yeah.
And just look at ourselves. So,
and I also feel like because we're so used to like instant gratification and like, all right, like let's just solve the problem and move on. It's like these kind of problems are like multi-generational. Like you can start to instill these lessons in the generation coming up now, and then you need to get it to a point where they can hand it off to the next generation. And then it's the generation that follows that one where you kind of really start to see like the full trajectory come in. And not a lot of people have the patience to wait. I mean, not a whole lot of us will even be here for, whenever the impact lands. But I mean, it goes back to another one of my favorite quotes, which is, society grows great when old men plant trees in whom shade they'll never sit. You've got to be doing the things that,
amen.
I think it's
Love it.
always interesting that, you'd mentioned your son. I have 2 daughters, and just evolutionarily, like, we'll do anything for our kids. Like, that's just built into who we are. And what's so, I think, fascinating about that is if you look at 32 generations away, so your kids, that descendant is no more related to you than a stranger is related to you today. And so if you could start to think with a mindset that cares about that generation 32 levels of kids away as much as you care about your kids, it's like the amount of change we can have and the care we could have for each other would be dramatically different than the way the world is organized now. And we're only now getting to a place where we have a level of abundance that even becomes possible. I mean, obviously that wasn't a thing that we could do in the past, because it was like, no, I've got to eat and I've got to feed my kids. And that's basically how evolution works. But we're getting to a place where if you can have that mentality and that shift to look out for every kid the way you would look out for your own kid, I think ultimately we'll be in a much better place. But it's a pretty Herculean shift.
It is a huge shift, and it's a huge shift when there's so many distractions with the social media and the dopamine and the media hits and all these things. And it's a big change. I think one of the historical models that shows the negative impact, the failure of the family or the parents not teaching the values, is you look at the history of the Israelites in the Bible. A lot of the fathers, even the guys who are great leaders for Israel, were terrible fathers. Their kids were just awful, and
Right.
Then that spanned multiple generations of problems afterwards. And I love what you're talking about in your manifesto, is that we don't have to we can make a choice, and we can be intentional and go in a different direction. So keep going. We can take extra time.
Yeah.
Just go for it.
So, and if we get to a place where it's like, great, now we've got all of these people able to contribute, there is, I think, going to be, I mean, if we think about technology changing quickly now, like, I can only imagine what it's going to look like, a handful of years from now. Is it's just going to be, I mean, new disruptions happen everywhere. Some will catch on, some won't, but that, exponential adoption curve is going to become almost like an immediate adoption curve, especially as we figure out what the manufacturing and everything looks like behind it. And so I think it's going to be really important to embrace and figure out like what our guidestones around technology are going to be, because it's going to be really easy for us to continue to go down the path that we are now, where it's like, great, I want to get more ads, so I want to get more clicks, so I need to make people angry. And so this is the kind of stuff that makes people angry. And I mean, you've seen it with, I think YouTube has been one of the ones that have been at least a little bit more forthcoming in their interviews about the way they've used their neural networks to optimize. And they were like, we optimize it to maximize watch time. And like, sure enough, you saw like all your recommended videos were suddenly like 30-minute videos. And it was things with more and more outrageous thumbnails, and it just whatever got people to do the things that were done. There was no intention behind it other than maximize this one metric. And so being really intentional about how we use technology moving forward and mindful of, I think, those kind of super stimuli issues is going to be important. Because then the next step is, I think we have to accept that technology is and should fundamentally alter us as a species. And I didn't think that this was going to be a thing people would have a whole lot of like friction with, but I've been very much surprised that whenever I talk about like, oh, like, whatever comes after humans, people are like, what do you mean after humans? Like, we're the end all be all. We're the best. And I was like, I don't think we're that, I mean, like, good compared to everything so far, but like, I think there's a lot of room for growth. Yeah. And there's a lot of pushback against that. And I also think it's going to be a slippery slope into how we make those adjustments to, ourselves, in terms of genetic engineering and like the technology that's becoming available from a biological perspective, is because very quickly, I think you go from a slippery slope to, if you have a child in utero and they're like, oh, we noticed they're going to be born with no legs, but we can edit this gene and they'll grow legs. Should we do that? And you'd be like, yeah, that seems reasonable. Like, why wouldn't you do that? And then I think you could very quickly go to like, oh, we see that they're going to be, about 5'4", let's say. And it's like, okay, well, statistics show that if you're over 6 foot, you technically earn more. So is that like a disadvantage? Should we like optimize for that? And from there you go into like select your genes and like you start to, I think, get dangerously close to people picking out like designer children. And if you have like one standard for what's great and you lose the trial and error and the variety brought about by evolution, we're going to be really, really at risk. And so that goes back to technology. But if we can embrace that, oh, we do have an ability to increase our consciousness. And my thought is, AI is great narrowly. I feel like any big breakthrough in terms of like AI having any level of consciousness is going to be us upgrading biological consciousness, not getting a machine to think in the way that we think. And so we have to be really intentional about what that could look like. And hey, if we do have a bigger, better brain and we can be more conscious of these things and help advance the world, what does that look like? What comes next? How do we treat the people that don't want to do that? Because obviously they have a freedom of choice. And I mean, if we look at the way we've treated our evolutionary ancestors, it's not exactly been a great, level of engagement in terms of fairness around freedom of choice or, freedom at all. So being really mindful about what that looks like and being able to then step into like the next step of evolution. And that's like kind of as far as I can think.
But I think that actually, and it's a good place for us to end because it circles back to your beginning. So if we're not supporting people who are good custodians, then they may be making these decisions about what we do with technology. Okay. And when you're talking about whether it's just, GMOs in our food or whether it's, how we're going to biologically engineer animals and then humans or whatever, or how we limit technology, if we're going to limit technology, which we have to limit technology, but who's going to decide where and what and how? And I mean, there are some incredibly difficult decisions that are going to need to be made.
Absolutely.
And then not only those decisions that need to be made, but I have a thing where I don't like laws if they're not enforceable. I don't care how good intentioned they are. If they're not enforceable, they're ridiculous. So, so who's going to come up with these laws? And then how are they going to be enforced? And are they going to be enforced fairly across everyone? They're not going to be enforced differently for the rich versus the poor or someone who has this color skin or ethnicity versus this other. We have to be extremely careful. And right now, the recent presidential election showed we've really got some problems as far as leaders at the top.
Yeah.
Who are people who are going to demonstrate good character and make decisions that are best for the country. And I don't care what side you're on.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. I think that it's a really easy to point to example of, I've seen this, I think that's emblematic of what's happening at like a macro level, but I think especially your audience would see this at a micro level, which is as at least I'll speak from my experience, as our company's grown, one of the things we've always tried to be really mindful of is we don't add so much procedure and documentation and processes that it starts to limit people's like freedom and ability to contribute and innovate. And you start to if you make things more and more granular, it becomes burdensome. Everyone kind of becomes an automaton and they're just kind of, in an assembly line, you may as well just be pressing a stamp. And I think we've seen like the same thing happen, like you mentioned with the presidential election, regardless of what side you're on, like the concession speech has been like, hey, it's not a thing that we like have in our laws that you have to do. It's just been a thing that everyone in the best interest has been like, look, I don't want to have another civil war. Ultimately, we're better together than we are apart. Shake hands, go about your merry way. And it's like, oh, somebody just kind of violating one of those little things that we just taken as kind of a norm that you do. Like if you start to get more and more granular and you start to say like, okay, well, now we're going to make that a requirement. But do they have to shake their hand? Well, then like you could always go in more and more granularity and someone can always find a way to like work through it. And ultimately, I think you have to have a culture and a collective understanding that serves as more of a foundation for some of those things than any level of just like you have to follow the rule to the letter. Because like you said, if it's not enforceable, like what good is it?
Yeah. So let's close this out because I could talk with you all day. I mean, this is fun. So Chris, how do people learn more about what you do? Because you're obviously doing good and you're doing it better with your team. And, want to get a hold of you, that type of thing.
Yeah. So I'll round out with kind of one thing. It was obviously we talked through the whole manifesto. One thing that I found was really impactful that might be useful for the audience was putting all this stuff on paper made it really easy for us to understand who is and who isn't a good fit to work for us. And by knowing, hey, this is what we stand for, this is what we represent, there are some clients that are going to be like, yes, like that's absolutely who we want to work with. And some aren't. And that polarizing nature of this makes sure that you work better with the people that you will work with better, and ultimately has yielded a lot of benefit. And that's gone for employees, vendors, partners, clients across the board for us. If you're interested in finding out more about us, you can find us at YokoCO. So that's YokoCO.com. And there's links to everything else from there.
Fabulous. Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate the conversation. I could have done like 10 podcasts with you where we just dive into the manifesto piece by piece. So this has been great.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you for indulging me and giving me a chance to, share some of those thoughts. It's been fun.